Blackwells Heart. Taken prisoner by Sir Rhys Montrose, the warrior who had conquered her father's lands, Lady Juliana of Thornwick expected cruelty. Instead, he studied her, dark amusement in his gaze. "You do not fear me, my lady," he murmured. "Tell me, should I find that intriguing or foolish?" Chapter 1. The Lion's Cage. The heavy oak door of the chamber slammed shut, the sound echoing through the cold stone walls, each reverberation a stark reminder of Juliana's new reality. She was a prisoner, not in some dank, rat-infested dungeon, but in a room that spoke of a somber luxury, a large four-poster bed draped with heavy velvet curtains, a thick rug woven with intricate patterns, and a window that offered a breathtaking, yet agonizing, view of the rolling hills and forests that were no longer hers. Thornwick, her home, her birthright, now belonged to the man who had ridden in at the head of an army, his banner a snarling black lion on a field of crimson snapping in the wind like a predator's flag. Sir Rhys Montrose. The name had been whispered in fear and hatred among her people for weeks, a dark cloud looming on the horizon. Now, that cloud had burst, and she, Lady Juliana of Thornwick, was caught in the storm. She ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of a polished wooden table, her fingers tracing the carvings of mythical beasts, a stark contrast to the very real beast who now controlled her fate. Juliana had faced him with a defiance she hadn't known she possessed, her chin lifted, her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, locked on his. She had expected rage, perhaps even violence, from the man who had slain her father in single combat. Instead, she had encountered curiosity. He was younger than she had anticipated, though the lines etched around his eyes and the grim set of his mouth spoke of battles fought and hardships endured. His hair was the color of dark raven's wings, framing a face that was undeniably striking, its sharp planes and angles softened only by the unexpected fullness of his lips. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a deep, penetrating gray, like polished steel, that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade of bravery. "You do not fear me, my lady," he had murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, tinged with a hint of, was it amusement? "Tell me, should I find that intriguing or foolish?" Her response had been immediate, fueled by grief and a desperate need to cling to her dignity. "Fear is a luxury I can no longer afford, Sir Knight. My father is dead. My lands are forfeit. What more is there to fear?" He had studied her for a long moment, the silence in the hall stretching taut as a bowstring. The only sound was the crackling of the torches in their sconces, casting flickering shadows that danced across his armor, making him seem larger than life, a figure of both power and menace. Then, a slow smile had curved his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Perhaps," he had said, his voice soft, yet laced with steel, "you underestimate the power of a conqueror, my lady, or the whims of a man who holds your life in his hands." His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of her precarious position. She was his prize, a spoil of war, to be disposed of as he saw fit. He could marry her off to some aging, brutish lord to secure an alliance, lock her away in a convent, or worse. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, a cold dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. Juliana walked to the window, her fingers gripping the cold stone sill. Below, the courtyard bustled with activity. Montrose's soldiers, their armor glinting in the afternoon sun, moved with a purposefulness that was both impressive and terrifying. They were dismantling the Thornwick banners, replacing them with the Black Lion of Montrose. Each flag raised was a nail hammered into the coffin of her former life. She closed her eyes, the image of her father's face, pale and lifeless, flashing behind her eyelids. She had seen him fall, had watched from the ramparts as Montrose's sword had pierced his armor, ending his life and shattering her world. The memory was a raw, gaping wound, a constant source of pain that threatened to consume her. But Juliana was not one to surrender to despair. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith, had taught her that tears were a weakness, that a lady of Thornwick must always meet adversity with courage and grace. And so, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and turned back to face the room, her prison, with a renewed sense of determination. She would not cower. She would not beg. She would find a way to survive, to protect what was left of her family, her people. She would use whatever weapons she had at her disposal, her wits, her beauty, even her defiance, to navigate this treacherous new world. She noticed a small, wooden chest tucked away in a corner of the room. Curiosity piqued, she knelt and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single object, a silver locket, intricately carved with a Thornwick rose. It was her mother's locket, a gift given to her by Juliana's father on their wedding day. She had thought it lost in the chaos of the siege. Tears, hot and stinging, welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. This was not a sign of weakness, she told herself, but a reminder of the love that still bound her to her family, to her past. It was a symbol of hope, a tangible link to the life she had lost, but also a promise of the strength she still possessed. Clutching the locket tightly in her hand, Juliana made a silent vow. She would not be broken. She would find a way to turn this captivity to her advantage, to play the game of power and intrigue with the skill of a seasoned player. She would gamble her very life, if necessary, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. And Sir Rhys Montrose, the Lion of the North, would soon discover that the Lady of Thornwick was not a prize to be easily won, but a force to be reckoned with. The game had begun, and in that high tower, it seemed all the world waited with bated breath to see who would be the ultimate victor. The wind whistled a lonely tune. Chapter 2. Whispers of Defiance. The first few days of Juliana's captivity were a blur of silent meals, long hours spent staring out the window, and the constant, gnawing ache of grief and uncertainty. Montrose's men treated her with a wary respect, their eyes following her every move, their hands never far from their swords. They were polite, even deferential, but the underlying message was clear. She was a prisoner, and her freedom was a privilege, not a right. She was allowed to walk in the castle gardens, a walled enclosure filled with neatly trimmed hedges, fragrant rose bushes, and a small, bubbling fountain. It was a beautiful space, a sanctuary of peace in the midst of chaos, but even here, she was never truly alone. A silent, watchful guard always accompanied her, his presence a constant reminder of her confinement. The castle itself was a labyrinth of stone corridors, echoing chambers, and hidden stairways. It was a far cry from the familiar warmth of Thornwick, with its sun-drenched courtyards and tapestry-hung walls. This place felt cold, imposing, a fortress built for war, not comfort. One evening, as she sat by the window in her chamber, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Alara, a young serving woman assigned to attend to her needs. Alara was a small, timid creature, with wide, brown eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her hands in her apron. "My lady," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of her skirts. "There are whispers among the servants." Juliana turned, her interest piqued. "Whispers? About what?" Alara hesitated, glancing nervously at the closed door. "About you, my lady. And Sir Rhys." Juliana's heart beat a little faster. "What are they saying?" They say he is taken with you, my lady. That he admires your spirit." Alara blushed, her cheeks turning a delicate shade of pink. "They say he speaks of you often in private, with his captain, Sir Gareth." Juliana frowned. This was unexpected. She had anticipated hatred, contempt, perhaps even a cruel indifference, but not admiration. It didn't fit with the image of the ruthless conqueror she had formed in her mind. "And what else?" She pressed, her voice low. Alara lowered her eyes. "They say he is considering making you an offer." Juliana's breath caught in her throat. An offer? What kind of offer? Marriage? That was the most likely scenario, a political alliance to secure his hold on Thornwick. The thought sent a wave of revulsion through her. To be forced to marry the man who had killed her father, to share his bed, to bear his children, it was unthinkable. But another, more insidious thought crept into her mind. Could she use this interest to her advantage? Could she manipulate him, play on his emotions, to gain her freedom, or perhaps even revenge? The idea was dangerous, reckless even, but it sparked a flicker of hope in the darkness of her despair. It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice, but she was running out of options. "Thank you, Alara," she said, dismissing the girl with a nod. "You have been helpful." Alara curtsied and slipped out of the room, leaving Juliana alone with her thoughts. She paced the floor, her mind racing, weighing the risks and the potential rewards. The locket, still clutched tightly in her hand, felt warm against her skin, a tangible reminder of her purpose. She would need to be careful, to tread lightly, to play the role of the demure, compliant captive while secretly plotting her escape, her revenge. She would need to learn more about Sir Rhys Montrose, to understand his weaknesses, his desires, his vulnerabilities. The next morning, during her walk in the gardens, she saw him for the first time since her arrival. He was standing by the fountain, his back to her, speaking in low tones with Sir Gareth, a tall, powerfully built man with a scarred face and a reputation for ruthlessness. As she approached, they fell silent, turning to face her. Montrose's eyes met hers, and a faint smile played on his lips. It was the same smile she had seen in the hall, the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice smooth and courteous. "I trust you are finding your accommodations acceptable?" "As acceptable as any cage can be, Sir Knight," she replied, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You are a woman of spirit, my lady. I admire that." "Spirit is all I have left, Sir Knight," she said, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "You have taken everything else." He stepped closer, his presence filling her senses. He smelled of leather and steel, a scent that was both intimidating and strangely alluring. "Not everything, my lady," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur.
"Not yet."
The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a silent battle of wills. Juliana held his gaze, refusing to back down, refusing to show any sign of fear. She was playing a dangerous game, but she was determined to win. She had to. The fate of Thornwick, and her own, hung in the balance. The weight felt immense. Chapter 3. The Knight's Scrutiny. The following days saw a subtle shift in the dynamic between Juliana and Sir Rhys. He sought her out more frequently, engaging her in conversations that ranged from the mundane to the surprisingly philosophical. He questioned her about Thornwick, its history, its people, its customs, displaying a genuine curiosity that both intrigued and unsettled her. He seemed particularly interested in her knowledge of herbal remedies and healing, a skill she had learned from her mother, who had been renowned throughout the region for her ability to treat illnesses and injuries. He asked her about the properties of various plants, the methods of preparing potions and poultices, and the secrets of tending to wounds. "My men suffer greatly from injuries sustained in battle," he explained one afternoon, as they walked together in the gardens. "The battlefield surgeon is skilled, but his knowledge is limited. I believe there is much we can learn from the wisdom of women, from the lore passed down through generations." Juliana was surprised by his open-mindedness. Most men of his stature dismissed such knowledge as women's work, unworthy of their attention. Yet, here he was, the conqueror of Thornwick, seeking her counsel on matters of healing. "My mother taught me that the earth provides all we need to heal ourselves," she replied, "if we only know where to look and how to use its gifts." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And you, my lady, possess that knowledge?" "I know some things," she admitted, "but my mother was the true healer. I am but a pale imitation." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Do not underestimate yourself, Lady Juliana. I sense a strength in you, a resilience that goes far beyond your knowledge of herbs and potions." His words sent a shiver down her spine. He was seeing through her carefully constructed facade, recognizing the fire that burned beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. It was both flattering and dangerous. She needed to maintain her guard, to keep him at arm's length, but his attention was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. He invited her to dine with him in his private chambers, a small but elegantly appointed room overlooking the courtyard. The meal was simple, but the conversation was anything but. He spoke of his own past, of his years spent fighting in foreign lands, of the losses he had endured, the burdens he carried. He revealed that he had been betrothed once to a woman he had loved deeply, but she had died of a fever before they could be wed. The pain in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his voice, revealed a vulnerability that she had not expected. It was a glimpse behind the mask of the warrior, a glimpse of the man beneath. "I have learned," he said, his voice low and somber, "that life is fleeting, that love is a precious gift, not to be taken lightly." Juliana found herself drawn to his honesty, his willingness to share his pain. She saw a reflection of her own grief in his eyes, a shared understanding of loss and longing. It was a dangerous connection, a bridge between captor and captive that threatened to blur the lines between them. He asked her about her own dreams, her own aspirations, before the war had shattered her world. She spoke of her love for Thornwick, of her desire to see its people prosper, of her hopes for a future that had seemed so bright, so full of promise. "And what of love, my lady?" he asked, his voice soft, his gaze intense. "Did you dream of finding a husband, of raising a family?" Juliana hesitated, her heart beating faster. This was dangerous territory. She could not afford to reveal her true feelings, her growing attraction to this man who was both her enemy and her captor. "I had hoped," she began, choosing her words carefully, "to find a man who would respect me, who would value my opinions, who would share my love for Thornwick." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement through her. "A noble aspiration, my lady, and perhaps not an impossible one." The unspoken implication hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities, with the potential for a future that was both terrifying and alluring. She should speak out, refute, deny the path this was leading down. But it was already too late. The night was closer to her than she realized. And so, she remained silent, trapped between fear and the faintest flicker of a forbidden hope, and she let the seed begin to grow, knowing full well the danger. The wind howled outside, a reminder. Chapter 4. A bargain struck in moonlight. The moon hung high in the sky, a silver disk casting long, ethereal shadows across the courtyard, as Juliana made her way to the stables. She had requested a private meeting with Sir Rhys, a request he had granted with a curious tilt of his head and a knowing glint in his eyes. She found him waiting for her, leaning against the rough-hewn wooden frame of a stall, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark cloak blending into the shadows. He looked more like a rogue than a knight in that moment, a dangerous, unpredictable element in the carefully ordered world of the castle. "You wish to see me, my lady?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Juliana took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had spent the past few days carefully planning this encounter, weighing every word, every gesture. She knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing between defiance and seduction, between the desire for freedom and the growing, undeniable pull she felt towards this man. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart, "about your offer." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "You have taken my lands, my home, my freedom," she said, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "But you have not broken my spirit. I am still Lady Juliana of Thornwick, and I will not be treated as a mere pawn in your game." He pushed himself away from the stall and stepped closer, his presence filling her senses. The scent of leather and horses and hay mingled with the faint, clean scent of his skin, creating a heady, intoxicating mix. "And what is it you propose, my lady?" he asked, his voice soft, yet laced with steel. "A trade? Your compliance in exchange for what?" Juliana met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I want my freedom," she said, her voice clear and strong. I want to be allowed to leave Thornwick, to go wherever I choose. He chuckled softly, a sound that was both amused and skeptical. And you believe I would simply let you go? After all I have fought for? After all I have sacrificed? Not without a price, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I am willing to offer you something in return. His eyes narrowed, his gaze intensifying. And what is that, my lady? Juliana took a step closer, her body almost touching his. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle tension in his muscles. She lifted her hand and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. My knowledge, she whispered, her voice husky. My skills. My loyalty. He caught her hand in his grip firm but not painful. He held her gaze, his eyes searching hers, trying to decipher the truth behind her words. You would betray your own people? He asked, his voice barely audible. My people are suffering under your rule, she replied, her voice unwavering. I would do anything to alleviate their suffering, to protect them from further harm, even if it means serving you. It was a lie, of course, a carefully crafted deception. She had no intention of betraying her people, of truly serving him. But she needed him to believe her, to trust her, if her plan was to succeed. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. The only sound was the soft snorting of the horses in their stalls, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. You are playing a dangerous game, my lady. I am aware of the risks, she replied, her voice steady. And you are willing to pay the price? If it means securing my freedom and the well-being of my people, she said, her voice firm, yes. He released her hand and stepped back, a flicker of something that looked like admiration in his eyes. Very well, my lady, he said. We have a bargain. I will grant you your freedom eventually, but in return you will serve me. You will use your knowledge, your skills, to help me rule Thornwick. You will advise me, guide me, be my eyes and ears among your people. It was not exactly what she had hoped for, but it was a start. It was a crack in the wall of her captivity, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She had bought herself time, an opportunity to learn more about him, to find his weaknesses, to plan her escape. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice challenging. His smile was slow and dangerous. Then you will remain my prisoner, my lady. And the fate of Thornwick and your people will rest entirely in my hands. The threat was clear, unmistakable. She had no choice. She had to play his game for now. I accept your terms, Sir Knight, she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within her. He nodded, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Then let us seal our bargain with a kiss. The request caught her off guard, sending a jolt of both fear and excitement through her. It was a test, a challenge, a way of gauging her commitment, her willingness to play the role he had assigned to her. The moon beat down with an eerie glow. Everything was riding on this. Chapter 5. Echoes of Lost Laughter. The kiss was a calculated move, a power play disguised as a romantic gesture, and Juliana knew it. Yet, as his lips met hers, a surprising wave of warmth washed over her. It wasn't the gentle, tentative kiss of a suitor, but a possessive, demanding claim, a brand of ownership that both angered and intrigued her. There was a roughness to it, a hint of the warrior beneath the veneer of civility, but also a surprising tenderness, a flicker of vulnerability that she hadn't expected. She responded, hesitantly at first, then with a growing boldness, matching his intensity, her own desires, long suppressed, rising to the surface. It was a dangerous dance, a blurring of the lines between captor and captive, between enemy and lover. The thought startled her, and she pulled back, breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't release her immediately, his hands lingering on her waist, his eyes searching hers. You are full of surprises, my lady, he murmured, his voice husky. I begin to see why my men speak of you with such awe. Juliana straightened her shoulders, regaining her composure. Do not mistake compliance for surrender, Sir Knight, she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. I am merely fulfilling my part of the bargain. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Of course, my lady. But I suspect there is more to you than meets the eye. And I intend to discover all your secrets. His words were a promise, a threat, a challenge. And Juliana, despite her fear, found herself strangely excited by the prospect. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Sir Rhys began to involve her in the affairs of Thornwick. He sought her advice on matters of governance, on disputes between villagers, on the management of the estates. He introduced her to his council, a group of hardened warriors and seasoned advisors who regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She quickly learned that ruling a conquered territory was a complex and challenging task. The people of Thornwick were resentful of Montrose's rule, resistant to his authority, and deeply suspicious of her, seeing her as a traitor, a collaborator. She walked a tightrope, balancing her loyalty to her people with her need to maintain Montrose's trust. She used her knowledge of local customs and traditions to mediate disputes, to ease tensions, to find solutions that were fair to both sides. She persuaded him to lower taxes, to release some of the prisoners taken during the siege, to allow the villagers to hold their traditional harvest festival. Slowly, cautiously, she began to win the trust of some of her people. They saw that she was not simply a puppet of the conqueror, that she genuinely cared about their well-being. They began to come to her with their problems, their concerns, their fears. She also began to see a different side of Sir Rhys. He was a harsh ruler, yes, but he was also a just one. He was a skilled strategist, a brilliant military commander, but he also possessed a deep sense of responsibility towards those under his command. He was ruthless with his enemies, but he was also fiercely loyal to his friends and allies. She found herself spending more and more time in his company, not just in council meetings, but in informal gatherings, in shared meals, in quiet conversations by the fire. She learned about his childhood, his training as a knight, his dreams for the future. He, in turn, listened with genuine interest as she spoke of her own life, her love for Thornwick, her hopes for a world without war, without conflict. One evening, as they sat together in the gardens, listening to the soft murmur of the fountain, he asked her about her mother's locket, the one she always wore around her neck. "It was a gift from my father," she explained, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the Thornwick rose. "He gave it to her on their wedding day. It's all I have left of them." He reached out and gently touched the locket, his fingers brushing against her skin. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice soft. "Like you." The compliment caught her off guard, sending a blush to her cheeks. She lowered her eyes, suddenly shy, unsure how to respond. He chuckled softly. "You still do not trust me, do you, my lady?"
"Should I?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
He sighed.
"I know I have given you little reason to," he admitted. "But I hope, in time, you will come to see me as more than just your conqueror." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Juliana looked up at him, her heart aching with a longing she couldn't deny. She saw a vulnerability in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. And in that moment, she realized that she was falling in love with him, with the man who had destroyed her world, with the man who held her captive, with the man who was her enemy. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. She couldn't let herself fall. But the memories, the ghost of laughter in the halls, made it all the more confusing. Where there should be hate, there was a flickering warmth. It was maddening. Chapter 6. The Serpent in the Garden. The fragile trust that had begun to grow between Juliana and Rhys was soon tested by the arrival of Lady Isolde de Valois, a wealthy and influential noblewoman from a neighboring territory. Isolde was a striking beauty, with long, flowing blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a reputation for being both ambitious and ruthless. She had been a close ally of Rhys's father, and there were rumors of a past connection between her and Rhys himself. Juliana immediately sensed that Isolde was a threat, not just to her position, but to her growing feelings for Rhys. Isolde made no secret of her disdain for Juliana, treating her with a thinly veiled contempt, dismissing her as a conquered nobody, a pawn in Rhys's game. "You must be careful, my lady," Alara whispered to Juliana one afternoon as they were gathering herbs in the castle gardens. "Lady Isolde is powerful. She has many friends at court, and she is not afraid to use her influence." Juliana nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. She had seen the way Isolde looked at Rhys, the possessive gleam in her eyes, the subtle way she touched his arm, his shoulder, whenever they were together. It was clear that Isolde saw Juliana as an obstacle, a rival to be eliminated. Isolde began to poison Rhys's mind against Juliana, whispering doubts about her loyalty, suggesting that she was secretly plotting with her people to overthrow him, that she was using her influence to undermine his authority. "She is playing you for a fool, Rhys," Isolde said one evening, as they were dining together in Rhys's private chambers. Juliana, seated at a smaller table nearby, could overhear their conversation. "She is a clever woman, but she is not to be trusted. She is still loyal to her father, to her people. She will betray you the first chance she gets." Rhys frowned, his gaze troubled. "I have seen no evidence of that," he said. "She has been helpful, insightful. She has earned the trust of many of the villagers." "That is all part of her plan," Isolde insisted, her voice silken and persuasive. "She is weaving a web of deceit, and you're falling right into it. You must be careful, Rhys. Your hold on Thornwick is still fragile. You cannot afford to be blinded by infatuation." Juliana's heart sank. She could see the doubt creeping into Rhys's eyes, the suspicion clouding his judgment. Isolde's words were like poison, slowly eroding the fragile bond between them. Rhys began to distance himself from Juliana, becoming more formal, more reserved. He stopped seeking her advice, stopped sharing his thoughts and feelings with her. He spent more and more time with Isolde, listening to her counsel, accepting her attentions. Juliana felt a growing sense of isolation, of despair. She had been so close to gaining his trust, to building a future, however uncertain, with him. Now, it seemed, all her efforts had been in vain. One afternoon, as she was walking in the gardens, she encountered Isolde alone. Isolde stopped her, her eyes flashing with triumph. "You are losing him, you know," Isolde said, her voice dripping with malice. "He is beginning to see you for what you truly are, a traitor, a deceiver. He will soon tire of your games, and then you will be discarded, like a broken toy." Juliana's temper flared. She had endured Isolde's taunts and insults long enough. "You may think you have won, my lady," she said, her voice trembling with anger, "but you are mistaken. Rhys is not a fool. He will see through your lies, your manipulations. And when he does, you will be the one who is discarded." Isolde laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You are naive, my lady. Men are easily swayed by beauty, by flattery, and I have both in abundance. You, on the other hand, have nothing to offer him but your dubious loyalty." Juliana took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "I may not have your beauty or your wealth," she said, her voice low and fierce, "but I have something you will never possess: integrity. And that, in the end, is what truly matters." She turned and walked away, leaving Isolde standing there, speechless, her face contorted with rage. Juliana knew she had made an enemy, a powerful and dangerous enemy. But she didn't care. She had spoken her truth, defended her honor. And that, she realized, was more important than any game of power or politics. But she also had planted the seed of an idea. If the whispers were true, if the game could be played, then Isolde of Valois had best beware. The serpent had bared her fangs, but Juliana of Thornwick was prepared to strike back. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, but on whom remained a question. Chapter 7. Shadows of the Past. The tension in the castle was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to weigh down everyone within its walls. Rhys was increasingly withdrawn, his mood shifting between brooding silence and sudden bursts of anger. He spent hours poring over maps and military reports, seemingly oblivious to Juliana's presence. Juliana, in turn, felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable. She had lost Rhys's trust, and with it, her sense of purpose, her hope for the future. She wandered through the castle like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, her heart heavy with a grief that was both familiar and new. One evening, as she was sitting alone in her chamber, staring out the window at the darkening sky, she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Alara, her face pale and worried. "My lady," Alara whispered, her voice trembling, "there are rumors, terrible rumors." Juliana's heart sank. "What rumors?" she asked, her voice barely audible. They say Sir Rhys plans to marry Lady Isolde," Alara said, her eyes wide with fear. "That the announcement will be made soon at the upcoming feast." The news hit Juliana like a physical blow. She had known it was a possibility, but to hear it confirmed, to know that it was imminent, was devastating. It meant the end of any hope she had of regaining her freedom, of building a life with Rhys, of saving Thornwick from Isolde's cruel grip. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of hopelessness that threatened to consume her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But she knew she couldn't. She had to remain strong, to maintain her composure, to find a way to survive. She thanked Alara and dismissed her, then sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to collect her thoughts. She had to do something, anything, to prevent this marriage from happening. But what? She had no power, no influence, no allies. She remembered the locket, her mother's locket, still tucked away in the wooden chest. She opened the chest and took out the locket, holding it tightly in her hand. It was a symbol of her past, of her family, of the life she had lost. But it was also a reminder of her strength, her resilience, her determination to never give up. As she gazed at the locket, a memory surfaced, a long-forgotten conversation with her father. He had been telling her about the history of Thornwick, about the secret passages and hidden chambers that had been built into the castle walls centuries ago. "There is a way," he had said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "to move through the castle unseen, unheard. A way to listen in on conversations, to gather information, to influence events." He had shown her the entrance to one of these passages, a hidden door concealed behind a tapestry in the library. He had made her swear never to reveal its existence to anyone, to use it only in times of dire need. Juliana realized that this was such a time. She had to find a way to uncover Isolde's secrets, to expose her lies, to prove her treachery to Rhys. The secret passages were her only hope. That night, after everyone in the castle had retired, Juliana made her way to the library. The room was dark and silent, the only light coming from the flickering embers in the fireplace. She found the tapestry her father had shown her, a depiction of a hunting scene, with stags and hounds and falconers. She ran her fingers along the edge of the tapestry, feeling for the hidden latch. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pressed down, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. The passage was narrow and dusty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. She moved slowly, cautiously, her hand trailing along the cold stone wall. She could hear the faint sounds of the castle above her, the muffled voices of guards, the creaking of floorboards, the occasional burst of laughter. She followed the passage as it twisted and turned, leading her deeper and deeper into the heart of the castle. She came to a small, grated opening that overlooked Rhys's private chambers. She could see him sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, looking utterly defeated. Isolde was there, too, standing behind him, her hands on his shoulders, her voice soft and soothing. Juliana strained to hear their conversation. "You must put her aside, Rhys," Isolde was saying. "She is a distraction, a liability. You need a wife who can strengthen your position, who can bring you wealth and power. I can offer you all that and more." Rhys sighed. "I know, Isolde. But I had hoped for what?" Isolde asked, her voice sharp. "Love? Happiness? Those are childish dreams, Rhys. You are a ruler, a warrior. You must think of your duty, your legacy." Juliana's heart ached for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the conflict in his soul. He was trapped, caught between his duty and his feelings. Suddenly, Isolde leaned down and kissed him, a long, passionate kiss. Rhys responded, hesitantly at first, then with a growing fervor. Juliana turned away, unable to watch. But as she did, she heard something else, a faint rustling sound coming from further down the passage. She moved closer, straining to hear. It was another voice, a man's voice, whispering something she couldn't quite make out. She crept along the passage until she came to another grated opening. This one overlooked a small, dimly lit chamber. She could see two figures huddled together in the shadows. One was Isolde, and the other was Sir Gareth, Rhys's captain, the man he trusted most. Juliana's blood ran cold. What were they doing together, meeting in secret, in the dead of night? She listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. And as she listened, she began to understand. Isolde and Gareth were lovers. And they were plotting against Rhys. The shadows seemed to grow longer in that moment. Chapter 8. A Dance of Deception. The revelation struck Juliana with the force of a physical blow. Isolde and Gareth, Rhys's trusted captain, were not only lovers but conspirators, plotting against the very man they pretended to serve. The implications were staggering, the potential consequences devastating. Juliana listened, her heart pounding in her chest, as they discussed their plans. They intended to use the upcoming marriage to Isolde as a cover for their treachery. They planned to weaken Rhys's hold on Thornwick, to stir up unrest among the people, to create an opportunity for a rival lord, Baron Elric, to seize control. Isolde would then marry Elric, securing her own position and power, while Gareth would be rewarded with lands and titles. Elric is growing impatient, Gareth said, his voice low and gravelly. He demands proof that we are committed to the plan. He will have his proof, Isolde replied, her voice cold and calculating. Once I am wed to Rhys, I will have access to his secrets, his resources. I will be able to control him, to manipulate him, to weaken him from within. And what of the Lady Juliana? Gareth asked, a hint of concern in his voice. She is clever, observant. She may suspect something. Isolde laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. She is a fool, blinded by her infatuation with Rhys. She is no threat to us. And if she does become a problem, we can easily dispose of her. Juliana's blood ran cold. She had to warn Rhys, to expose their treachery before it was too late. But how? She couldn't simply confront him with her accusations. He wouldn't believe her, especially not with Isolde whispering poison in his ear. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would convince him of their betrayal. She carefully retraced her steps through the secret passage, her mind racing, formulating a plan. She knew she was taking a terrible risk, that if she were caught, the consequences would be dire. But she had no choice. She had to protect Rhys, to save Thornwick, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. The next morning, Juliana sought out Rhys, finding him in the training yard, practicing swordplay with his men. He looked tired and drawn, the lines of strain etched around his eyes and mouth. Sir Rhys, she said, her voice calm and steady, despite the turmoil within her, I need to speak with you. In private. He frowned, his gaze wary. What is it, my lady? It is a matter of grave importance, she said, her voice low. It concerns Lady Isolde. His expression hardened. I will not listen to any more accusations against her, he said, his voice cold. She is to be my wife. You will show her the respect she deserves. I understand her feelings, Sir Rhys, Juliana said, choosing her words carefully. But I implore you, hear me out. I have information that could affect the security of Thornwick. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He saw something there, a sincerity, a desperation, that made him pause. Very well, my lady, he said, his voice grudging. I will grant you a few minutes. But be warned, if this is another attempt to slander Lady Isolde, you will regret it. He led her to a small, secluded alcove, away from the prying eyes and ears of his men. Juliana took a deep breath and began to speak, recounting everything she had overheard in the secret passage, the details of Isolde and Gareth's plot, their plan to betray him to Baron Elric. Rhys listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. He didn't interrupt her, didn't question her, but she could see the disbelief, the anger, the growing sense of betrayal in his eyes. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. Then, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You expect me to believe that the woman I am to marry, the man I trust above all others, are plotting against me?" "I know it is difficult to accept," Juliana said, her voice pleading. "But I swear to you, it is the truth. I have no reason to lie." He stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his body taut with tension. She could see the war raging within him, the struggle between his reason and his emotions, between his trust in Isolde and his growing feelings for her. "If what you say is true," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "then I am surrounded by enemies. I am a fool, a blind, trusting fool." "You must trust in your own good judgment, my lord," she implored. "Do not let the web spun by others ensnare you. I only wish what is best." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "And why, my lady?" he asked, his voice soft. "Why would you risk your life to warn me? Why would you betray your own kind to protect me?" Juliana's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment of truth. She had to be honest with him, to reveal her true feelings, even if it meant risking everything. "Because," she whispered, her voice trembling, I care for you, Rhys. More than I should. More than is wise. More than is safe." His eyes widened, surprise and something else, something that looked like hope, flickering in their depths. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Juliana," he murmured, his voice husky. But before he could say more, a shout rang out from the courtyard. "Sir Rhys, Baron Elric's men are at the gates. They demand entry." It created a sudden chilling moment. Chapter 9. The Falcon's Flight. The news of Baron Elric's arrival sent a wave of panic through the castle. Soldiers rushed to their posts, weapons were drawn, and the heavy gates were barred. Rhys, his face grim, his eyes flashing with anger, turned to Juliana. "It seems your warning was timely, my lady," he said, his voice tight, with controlled fury. "But how did Elric know? How did he know to strike now, when I am at my most vulnerable?" Juliana's mind raced. Isolde. It had to be Isolde. She must have sent word to Elric, informing him of the planned marriage, of Rhys's weakened state, of the opportunity to seize Thornwick. "Isolde," she said, her voice urgent. "She must have betrayed you. She must have sent word to Elric." Rhys's jaw clenched. "I will deal with her later," he said, his voice cold and deadly. "First, we must defend Thornwick." He turned and strode towards the battlements, barking orders to his men, his every movement radiating a sense of command and authority. Juliana followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen him like this, so focused, so determined, so dangerous. From the ramparts, they could see Elric's forces arrayed before the castle gates. They were a formidable sight, a sea of men and horses, their banners a silver falcon on a field of blue snapping in the wind. Elric himself, a tall, powerfully built man with a cruel, hawk-like face, rode forward, his voice booming across the courtyard. "Rhys Montrose," he shouted, "I have come to claim what is rightfully mine. Thornwick belongs to me, by right of conquest. Surrender now, and I will spare your lives." Rhys's response was swift and defiant. "Thornwick is mine, Elric," he roared, "and I will defend it to my last breath. You will never take it from me." The battle was joined. Arrows rained down from the castle walls, met by a volley of stones and spears from Elric's siege engines. The air was filled with the clang of steel, the screams of men, the thunder of hooves. Juliana, despite her fear, remained at Rhys's side, watching the battle unfold with a mixture of dread and determination. She saw the courage of Rhys's men, their loyalty to their lord, their willingness to fight and die for Thornwick. But she also saw the strength of Elric's forces, their superior numbers, their relentless assault. As the fighting raged, Juliana noticed a small group of Elric soldiers attempting to scale the castle walls, using ropes and grappling hooks. They were targeting a section of the wall that was poorly defended, a blind spot that had been overlooked in the chaos of the battle. "Rhys," she cried, pointing to the approaching soldiers. "They're trying to breach the walls." Rhys saw them and immediately dispatched a group of his men to intercept them. But it was too late. The enemy soldiers had already reached the top of the wall, and a fierce hand-to-hand fight ensued. Juliana watched in horror as one of Elric's men, a burly, scarred brute, broke through the defenses and charged towards Rhys, his sword raised. Without thinking, Juliana grabbed a discarded bow and arrow from a fallen archer. She had never used a weapon before, but her instincts took over. She knocked the arrow, drew back the string, and aimed at the charging soldier. Her hand trembled, her heart pounded, but she held her breath and released the arrow. It flew straight and true, piercing the soldier's shoulder, causing him to stumble and fall. Rhys turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw what she had done. He gave her a brief nod of gratitude, then turned back to the fight, his sword flashing in the sunlight. Juliana's act of bravery inspired the defenders, giving them renewed courage and determination. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves, pushing back Elric's men, repelling their assault. The battle raged for hours, a brutal, bloody struggle for control of Thornwick. But in the end, Rhys's forces, outnumbered but not outmatched, prevailed. Elric's army was routed, their attack repulsed, their hopes of conquest dashed. As the fighting subsided and the cries of battle gave way to the groans of the wounded, Rhys turned to Juliana, his face streaked with sweat and blood, his armor dented and scarred. "You saved my life, my lady," he said, his voice hoarse. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Juliana shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I did what anyone would have done," she said, her voice trembling. "I could not stand by and watch you die." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "You are extraordinary, Juliana," he said, his voice soft. "Brave, resourceful, loyal. I was a fool to doubt you." He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of admiration, of love. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a future, however uncertain, together. But the falcon had been driven off. The question was, would it return, and what of the serpent in their midst? The day was won, but not the war. Chapter 10. Beneath a waning moon. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of both relief and devastation. The courtyard was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both friend and foe. The wounded were tended to in the great hall, which had been transformed into a makeshift hospital. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and smoke. Juliana, despite her exhaustion, worked tirelessly alongside the other women of the castle, tending to the injured, binding wounds, offering comfort and solace. She moved among the wounded with a grace and compassion that belied her noble birth, her hands gentle, her voice soothing, her presence a beacon of hope in the midst of despair. Rhys, too, was everywhere, overseeing the cleanup, organizing the defenses, ensuring that his men were cared for. He moved with a quiet authority, his presence a source of strength and reassurance to his people. As the night wore on, and the moon began to wane, casting long, eerie shadows across the castle walls, Rhys sought out Juliana. He found her in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, her head bowed in prayer. He stood silently for a moment, watching her, his heart filled with a mixture of emotions, gratitude, admiration, and a growing, undeniable love. He had been so blind, so foolish, to doubt her, to allow Isolde's lies to poison his mind. He approached her quietly and knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. She looked up, her eyes startled, then softened as she saw him. "Rhys," she whispered, her voice filled with concern. "Are you all right? Are you injured?" He shook his head. I am well, my lady, he said, his voice hoarse. Thanks to you. He took her hand in his grip firm but gentle. I owe you an apology, Juliana, he said, his voice filled with remorse. I was a fool to doubt you, to believe Isolde's lies. I let my fear, my pride, cloud my judgment. I almost lost everything, including you. Juliana's eyes filled with tears. It is all right, Rhys, she said, her voice trembling. I understand. You were under a great deal of pressure, and she is a master manipulator. What will you do with her? She asked, the steel returning. She is imprisoned in the tower, he said, his voice cold. She will be dealt with appropriately. He paused, his gaze searching hers. But that is not what I came to speak to you about, he said, his voice softening. I came to thank you for saving my life, for saving Thornwick, for believing in me, even when I did not believe in myself. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. I have been a fool, Juliana, he repeated, his voice husky. I have allowed my past, my fears, to control me. I have pushed away the one person who has shown me true loyalty, true kindness, true love. Juliana's heart skipped a beat. She had longed to hear those words from him, but she had never dared to hope. Rhys, she whispered, her voice trembling. He silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. Let me speak, my lady, he said, his voice soft. I have been a warrior, all my life. I have faced death countless times, but I have never been so afraid as I was today, when I thought I might lose you. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking with hers. I love you, Juliana, he said, his voice clear and strong. I love you with all my heart, with all my soul. I know I am not worthy of you, but I cannot imagine my life without you. Tears streamed down Juliana's cheeks, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. She had never thought she would hear those words from him, that she would ever be allowed to feel this way. I love you too, Rhys, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I have loved you from the moment I first saw you, even when I thought you were my enemy. He smiled, a slow, tender smile that lit up his face. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was both passionate and gentle, a kiss that sealed their love, a kiss that promised a future together, a future free from fear, from doubt, from betrayal. But even as they embraced, lost in the moment, a shadow lingered in the back of Juliana's mind. Isolde. She was still a threat, a danger, a serpent waiting to strike. And Juliana knew that their newfound happiness, their fragile love, could be shattered in an instant. The waning moon seemed to offer a warning. Even bathed in this soft light, something cruel remained. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom. The days following the battle were filled with a cautious optimism. Rhys, freed from Isolde's influence, seemed a changed man. He was more open, more compassionate, more willing to listen to Juliana's counsel. He worked tirelessly to rebuild Thornwick, to heal the wounds of war, to earn the trust and loyalty of his people. Juliana, too, blossomed under his attention. She felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, that she had not experienced since before her father's death. She worked alongside Rhys, advising him, guiding him, helping him to navigate the complex web of medieval politics and intrigue. But the threat of Isolde still hung over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Rhys had imprisoned her in the highest tower of the castle, but he had not yet decided her fate. He was torn between his desire for justice and his fear of provoking further conflict with Baron Elric, who was still a powerful and dangerous enemy. Juliana knew that Isolde was too dangerous to be left alive. She was a master manipulator, a skilled schemer, and she would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. As long as she lived, she posed a threat to Rhys, to Thornwick, to their future together. One evening, as they were walking together in the gardens, Juliana broached the subject with Rhys. What will you do with Isolde? She asked, her voice low and serious. Rhys sighed, his face troubled. I do not know, Juliana, he admitted. She deserves to die for her treachery, but I fear the consequences. Elric will use her death as an excuse to attack again, and we are not yet strong enough to withstand another assault. She is too dangerous to be left alive, Juliana insisted, her voice firm. She will find a way to escape, to cause more trouble. You must deal with her swiftly and decisively. Rhys looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. You are a strong woman, Juliana, he said, his voice soft. You have a warrior's heart. I have learned to be strong, she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. I have had to be. I have lost too much to be weak. He took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. I know, my love, he said, his voice tender. And I will protect you, always. I will not let anyone harm you. But Juliana knew that his words, however heartfelt, were not enough. She had to take matters into her own hands. She could not risk Isolde's escape, her continued threat to their lives. That night, Juliana made a decision. She would deal with Isolde herself. She would ensure that the woman who had caused so much pain and suffering would never threaten them again. She waited until the castle was quiet, until everyone was asleep. Then, she slipped out of her chamber and made her way to the tower where Isolde was imprisoned. She had bribed a guard, a young man who was sympathetic to her cause, to give her access to the tower. She climbed the narrow, winding staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the top of the tower and found the guard waiting for her, his face pale and nervous. My lady, he whispered, his voice trembling. Are you sure about this? It is a dangerous thing you are doing. I am sure, Juliana said, her voice firm. I have no other choice. The guard handed her a key, and she unlocked the door to Isolde's cell. She stepped inside, her hand resting on the hilt of a small dagger she had concealed beneath her cloak. The cell was small and sparsely furnished, with only a narrow bed, a stool, and a small window overlooking the courtyard. Isolde was asleep on the bed, her blonde hair spread out on the pillow, her face pale and serene. Juliana stood there for a moment, looking down at her enemy, her heart filled with a mixture of hatred and pity. She had never killed anyone before, and the thought of taking a life, even Isolde's, filled her with revulsion. But she knew she had to do it. It was the only way to protect Rhys, to secure their future, to ensure the safety of Thornwick. She drew the dagger from her cloak, her hand trembling. She raised it above Isolde's sleeping form, steeling herself for the act. But as she looked down at Isolde's face, she saw something that stopped her. A single tear traced a path down Isolde's cheek. It was a tear of sadness? Of regret? Juliana hesitated, her resolve wavering. Could she really do this? Could she take a life in cold blood? Even the life of her enemy? Suddenly, Isolde's eyes opened. She looked up at Juliana, her gaze filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. You cannot do it, can you? Isolde whispered, her voice hoarse. Juliana lowered the dagger, her hand shaking. I know, Isolde said, her voice soft. You are not like me. You have a good heart. You cannot kill. Isolde sat up, her gaze fixed on Juliana's. I have done terrible things, she admitted, her voice filled with remorse. I have betrayed Rhys. I have plotted against him. I have caused so much pain and suffering. I deserve to die. But, she continued, her voice pleading, I beg you, spare my life. Give me a chance to redeem myself. I can help you. I can help Rhys. I know Elric's plans, his weaknesses. I can help you defeat him. Juliana stared at her, her mind reeling. Could she trust Isolde? Was this another trick, another manipulation? Or was it a genuine offer of help? The choice was now a life for a life, vengeance for a gamble. Chapter 12. Scars of the Heart. Juliana lowered the dagger, her hand still trembling. She looked into Isolde's eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of treachery. But all she saw was a raw, desperate plea for redemption, a glimmer of genuine remorse. Why should I trust you? Juliana asked, her voice still harsh, but with a flicker of uncertainty. You have betrayed everyone who has ever trusted you. Isolde nodded, her gaze unwavering. I know, she said, her voice filled with self-loathing. "I've been driven by ambition, by greed, by a desire for power. I have hurt so many people, caused so much pain. But I am not beyond redemption. I can change. I want to change." She reached out and took Juliana's hand, her grip surprisingly strong.
"Please," she begged. "Give me a chance."
"Let me prove to you that I am not the woman you think I am. Let me help you defeat Elric. Let me atone for my sins." Juliana hesitated, her mind torn. She knew that trusting Isolde was a risk, a dangerous gamble. But she also saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility of turning an enemy into an ally, of using Isolde's knowledge and skills to their advantage. She thought of Rhys, of his desire for peace, of his willingness to forgive, even his enemies. She thought of Thornwick, of its people, of their need for stability, for security, for a future free from war. "I will give you one chance," Juliana said, her voice firm, but with a hint of compassion. "One chance to prove your loyalty, to show me that you are truly remorseful. But if you betray me, if you try to harm Rhys or Thornwick, I will not hesitate to end you." Isolde nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for sparing my life. I will not disappoint you. I swear it." Juliana released her hand and stepped back, her gaze still wary. "We will speak more in the morning," she said. "For now, remain here. Do not attempt to escape. I will have guards watching you." She turned and left the cell, locking the door behind her. She returned to her chamber, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had spared Isolde's life, but she had also taken on a great responsibility, a dangerous burden. The next morning, Juliana informed Rhys of her decision. He was initially shocked, angry even, that she had defied his authority, that she had taken such a risk. "You should have consulted me," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You could have been killed. Isolde is a dangerous woman." "I know," Juliana said, her voice calm, "but I believe she can be useful to us. She knows Elric's plans, his weaknesses. She can help us defeat him." Rhys looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the conviction in her voice. He knew that she had made her decision and that she would not be swayed. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I trust your judgment, Juliana," he said, his voice softening. "I know you would not do anything to endanger Thornwick or me." He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "But be careful, my love," he said, his voice tender. "Do not trust Isolde completely. She is still a serpent, and she may yet strike." Juliana nodded, her heart filled with gratitude for his trust, for his understanding. "I will be careful," she promised. "I will not let her deceive me." Over the next few days, Juliana worked closely with Isolde, questioning her, probing her for information, testing her loyalty. Isolde, true to her word, proved to be a valuable ally. She revealed Elric's plans for a renewed assault on Thornwick, his alliances with other rebellious lords, his strategies, his weaknesses. Juliana shared this information with Rhys, and together, they devised a plan to counter Elric's attack, to strengthen their defenses, to turn the tables on their enemy. But even as they worked together, Juliana could not shake the feeling of unease, the sense that something was not quite right. Isolde was too cooperative, too eager to please, too perfect. One evening, as Juliana was walking through the castle gardens, she overheard a conversation between two of Rhys's guards. They were talking about Isolde, about how she had been seen whispering to one of the servants, a young woman who was known to be sympathetic to Elric's cause. Juliana's heart sank. Her suspicions were confirmed. Isolde was playing a double game. She was pretending to help them, while secretly plotting with Elric, feeding him information, preparing for another betrayal. Juliana knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't confront Isolde directly, not yet. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would convince Rhys of Isolde's continued treachery. But every scar told a story, and Juliana's heart carried too many. Chapter 13. A Tapestry of Lies. Juliana decided to use the secret passages once more, to spy on Isolde, to gather the evidence she needed to expose her treachery. She waited until nightfall, then slipped into the library, activating the hidden mechanism behind the tapestry. She followed the narrow, dusty passage until she reached the grated opening that overlooked Isolde's cell. She could see Isolde inside, pacing back and forth, her face agitated, her movements restless. Juliana watched and listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited for Isolde to make contact with her accomplice, to reveal her true intentions. After what seemed like an eternity, Isolde stopped pacing and approached the small window of her cell. She looked out into the darkness, then whispered something Juliana couldn't quite make out. A moment later, a small, dark figure appeared outside the window. It was the young servant woman, the one who was known to be sympathetic to Alric's cause. Juliana strained to hear their conversation, her ears straining to catch every word. "Have you secured the information?" Isolde whispered, her voice urgent. "Yes, my lady," the servant replied, her voice barely audible. "I have learned the details of Rhys's plan. He intends to ambush Alric's forces in the forest of Eldoria." "Good," Isolde said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "And have you delivered my message to Alric?" "Yes, my lady," the servant confirmed. "He awaits your signal." "Excellent," Isolde said, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Then all is in place. Soon, Rhys Montrose will be dead, and Thornwick will be mine." Juliana had heard enough. She had the proof she needed. Isolde was still plotting against Rhys, still working with Elric, still a traitor. She carefully retraced her steps through the secret passage, her mind racing. She had to warn Rhys, to expose Isolde's treachery before it was too late. She found Rhys in his private chambers, poring over maps and military reports. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with concern. "Juliana," he said, his voice weary. "What is it? What troubles you?" "I have discovered Isolde's treachery," she said, her voice urgent. "She is still plotting with Elric. She has been feeding him information, preparing for another betrayal." Rhys frowned, his gaze skeptical. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Have you proof?" Juliana recounted everything she had overheard in the secret passage, the details of Isolde's conversation with the servant, her plan to betray him to Elric. Rhys listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. He didn't interrupt her, didn't question her, but she could see the anger, the betrayal, the growing sense of disillusionment in his eyes. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "I should have known," he said, his voice bitter. "I should have listened to you. I was a fool to trust her, to believe her lies." He stood up and paced the room, his hands clenched into fists, his body taut with tension. "I will deal with her," he said, his voice cold and deadly. "I will make her pay for her treachery." "No, Rhys," Juliana said, her voice pleading. "Do not resort to violence. There is another way. We can use her, turn her own deception against her." Rhys stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyebrows raised. "What do you mean?" Juliana explained her plan. They would use Isolde's treachery to their advantage. They would feed her false information, lure Elric into a trap, and crush his forces once and for all. Rhys listened intently, his mind racing. He saw the brilliance of her plan, the cunning, the audacity of it. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was their best chance of defeating Elric and securing Thornwick. "You are a remarkable woman, Juliana," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You have a sharp mind, a brave heart, and a devious streak." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up his face. "Very well, my lady," he said. "We will play her game, but we will play it better. We will weave a tapestry of lies that will ensnare her, and Elric, and all our enemies." And so, they began their own dance of deception, feeding Isolde false information, manipulating her, using her as a pawn in their own game of power and intrigue. The tapestry of lies began, woven from the shadows of deception. Chapter 14. The Unveiling. The plan was set in motion. Juliana, with Rhys's approval, continued to meet with Isolde, pretending to trust her, to confide in her, while secretly feeding her false information about Rhys's military strategies. Isolde, believing she had Juliana completely fooled, eagerly passed this information on to Elric, convinced that she was leading him to victory. She envisioned herself as the future ruler of Thornwick, the power behind the throne, the mastermind of Rhys's downfall. Rhys, meanwhile, prepared his forces for the ambush, carefully positioning his men in the forest of Eldoria, the location they had falsely revealed to Isolde. He was determined to crush Elric's army once and for all, to end the threat to Thornwick and secure his rule. The day of the planned ambush arrived. Elric, confident of victory, led his forces into the forest, unaware that he was walking into a trap. He expected to find Rhys's army scattered and vulnerable, easy prey for his superior numbers. Instead, he found himself surrounded by Rhys's men, who emerged from their hidden positions, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. The battle was joined, a fierce, bloody clash of steel and will. Rhys, leading the charge, fought with a ferocity and determination that inspired his men. He cut down enemy soldiers left and right, his sword a blur of motion, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. Juliana, watching from a safe distance, felt a surge of pride and admiration for him. He was a true warrior, a leader, a king in all but name. She had never loved him more than she did in that moment. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. Rhys's forces, better prepared and better led, routed Elric's army, inflicting heavy casualties. Elric himself was captured, his dreams of conquest shattered, his ambition turned to ashes. As the fighting subsided and the cries of battle gave way to the groans of the wounded, Rhys sought out Juliana. He found her tending to the injured, her hands stained with blood, her face pale but resolute. He approached her, his armor dented and scarred, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "It is over, Juliana," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have won. Elric is defeated." Juliana looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. "Thank the gods," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is finally over." He smiled, a tired but triumphant smile. "Not quite," he said, his voice soft. "There is still one loose end to tie up." He turned and looked towards the castle, where Isolde was still imprisoned, awaiting her fate. He knew what he had to do. He led Juliana back to the castle, his arm around her waist, his presence a source of comfort and strength. They walked in silence, their hearts filled with a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering sadness. They reached the tower where Isolde was held. Rhys ordered the guards to bring her to the great hall. He wanted to confront her in front of his council, in front of his people, to expose her treachery for all to see. Isolde was brought before them, her hands bound, her face defiant. She looked at Rhys, her eyes filled with hatred and contempt. "You have won, Montrose," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "But you will never truly rule Thornwick. You are a weak, sentimental fool, blinded by your love for this traitorous wench." She glared at Juliana, her eyes blazing with fury. "You may have won this battle," she hissed, "but you will never win the war. I will see you both dead, even if it takes my last breath." Rhys stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "Your threats are empty, Isolde," he said, his voice like ice. "Your reign of terror is over. You have betrayed me, you have plotted against me, you have caused the deaths of countless innocent people. You deserve to die." He drew his sword, the steel gleaming in the torchlight. The hall fell silent, everyone watching, waiting, holding their breath. But before Rhys could strike, Juliana stepped forward, her hand resting on his arm. "No, Rhys," she said, her voice firm. "Do not kill her. Not like this." Rhys looked at her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked. "She deserves to die. She is a traitor, a murderer." "I know," Juliana said, her voice calm. "But killing her will not bring back the dead. It will not heal the wounds she has inflicted. It will only perpetuate the cycle of violence and hatred. She turned to Isolde, her gaze steady and unwavering. I will not let you define me, Isolde, she said, her voice clear and strong. I will not let your hatred consume me. I choose a different path. I choose mercy. She turned back to Rhys, her eyes pleading. Let her live, Rhys, she said, her voice soft. Banish her. Send her away from Thornwick, never to return. Let her live with the knowledge of her defeat, with the shame of her betrayal. That is a far greater punishment than death. Rhys hesitated, his sword still raised, his face torn between his desire for justice and his love for Juliana. He looked into her eyes, and he saw the wisdom, the compassion, the strength that lay within her. He lowered his sword, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Very well, my lady, he said, his voice weary. You have shown me a better way. I will spare her life. He turned to the guards. Take her away, he ordered. Banish her from Thornwick, never to return. If she ever sets foot on my lands again, she will be executed without mercy. The guards led Isolde away, her head bowed in shame, her spirit broken. The hall remained silent, everyone stunned by Juliana's act of mercy, by her unexpected display of compassion. The unveiling had been a choice, a mercy, a twist none expected. Chapter 15. Flames of Rebellion. The banishment of Isolde, while a victory for Juliana and Rhys, did not bring the peace they had hoped for. The embers of rebellion, fanned by Elric's failed uprising and Isolde's lingering influence, still smoldered beneath the surface of Thornwick's seemingly calm exterior. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of discontent, of secret meetings, of plots to overthrow Rhys and restore Thornwick to its rightful rulers. These rumors, fueled by the resentment of some of the older nobility who had lost power and prestige under Rhys's rule, began to gain traction among the common folk, who were still struggling to recover from the devastation of the war. Juliana, ever vigilant, noticed the growing unrest. She heard the whispers in the marketplace, saw the furtive glances in the streets, felt the tension in the air. She knew that this new threat, this insidious rebellion, was even more dangerous than Elric's open assault. She brought her concerns to Rhys, urging him to take action, to address the grievances of the people, to root out the sources of the discontent. We cannot afford to be complacent, Rhys, she said, her voice filled with urgency. This rebellion is like a hidden fire, slowly spreading beneath the surface. If we do not extinguish it quickly, it will erupt into a conflagration that will consume us all. Rhys, however, was reluctant to act. He had grown weary of conflict, of suspicion, of the constant need to be on guard. He longed for peace, for stability, for a chance to finally enjoy the fruits of his victory. I am tired of fighting, Juliana, he said, his voice filled with exhaustion. I am tired of suspicion and distrust. I want to believe that my people are loyal, that they appreciate what I have done for them. I understand, Rhys, Juliana said, her voice softening. But we cannot afford to be naive. There are those who will never accept your rule, who will always seek to undermine you. We must be vigilant. We must be proactive. We must be ruthless, if necessary. Rhys looked at her, his eyes troubled. He knew she was right, but he was hesitant to resort to the harsh measures she was suggesting. He had hoped to rule with compassion, with fairness, with a gentle hand. I will not become a tyrant, Juliana, he said, his voice firm. I will not rule through fear. I will find another way. He decided to call a council of all the leading nobles of Thornwick, both those who had supported him and those who had opposed him. He hoped to address their concerns, to listen to their grievances, to find a way to reconcile their differences and unite them under his rule. The council meeting was a tense affair. The old nobility, resentful of their loss of power, voiced their complaints openly, accusing Rhys of favoring the common folk, of ignoring their traditions, of disrespecting their authority. Rhys listened patiently, attempting to reason with them, to offer compromises, to find common ground. But his efforts were met with resistance, with stubbornness, with a deep-seated resentment that seemed impossible to overcome. Juliana, watching from the sidelines, felt a growing sense of frustration and despair. She saw that Rhys's attempts at reconciliation were failing, that the old nobility were too entrenched in their ways, too blinded by their pride, to accept his rule. She knew that she had to intervene, to take a more active role in the proceedings. She could not stand by and watch as Thornwick slipped back into chaos and conflict. She stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, addressing the assembled nobles. "My lords," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I understand your concerns, your grievances, your resentment. You have lost power, prestige, privilege. You feel that your traditions have been ignored, your authority undermined." She paused, her eyes locking with those of the most vocal critics of Rhys's rule. "But I ask you," she continued, her voice firm, "what is the alternative? Do you truly believe that returning to the old ways, to the constant warfare, the endless feuds, the oppression of the common folk is the best path for Thornwick? Do you not see," she pleaded, her voice filled with passion, "that Rhys is offering you a better way? A way of peace, of prosperity, of unity? A way to build a stronger, more just, more secure Thornwick for all?" Her words had a profound effect on some of the nobles, those who were not completely blinded by their resentment. They began to see the wisdom of her arguments, the futility of their resistance, the potential for a better future under Rhys's rule. But others remained defiant, their hearts hardened against any compromise, any reconciliation. They continued to whisper their discontent, to plot their rebellion, to fan the flames of unrest. A fire began. Small, but it had begun. Chapter 16. Beyond the castle walls. Despite Juliana's impassioned plea, the undercurrent of rebellion continued to grow, fueled by the stubborn resistance of the old nobility and the lingering influence of Isolde, who, though banished, still had loyalists within Thornwick. Secret meetings were held in darkened taverns and hidden forest glades, where disgruntled nobles and resentful commoners plotted to overthrow Rhys and restore the old order. Juliana, aware of the growing danger, urged Rhys to take decisive action, to root out the conspirators and crush the rebellion before it could gain further momentum. But Rhys, still clinging to his hope of ruling through compassion and understanding, hesitated to use force, fearing that it would only exacerbate the situation and alienate his people further. Frustrated by Rhys's reluctance, Juliana decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew that she could not sit idly by and watch as Thornwick descended into chaos. She had to act, even if it meant defying Rhys's wishes and risking his disapproval. She began to gather her own intelligence, using her network of contacts among the servants, the merchants, and the common folk to identify the key players in the rebellion, to uncover their plans, to learn their secrets. She discovered that the leader of the rebellion was Lord Bardolph, a powerful and influential nobleman who had been one of Rhys's most vocal critics at the council meeting. Bardolph, fueled by his resentment of Rhys and his ambition to reclaim his lost power, had been secretly amassing weapons and recruiting followers, preparing for an armed uprising. Juliana knew that she had to act quickly. She had to find a way to expose Bardolph's treachery and prevent the rebellion from erupting. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, allies she could trust. She decided to reach out to a group of unlikely allies, the women of Thornwick. She had seen their strength, their resilience, their unwavering loyalty during the siege and the subsequent battle. She knew that they, too, had a vested interest in maintaining peace and stability, in protecting their homes and families. She secretly summoned a group of women from all walks of life, noblewomen, merchants' wives, farmers' daughters, even a few of the castle servants, to a clandestine meeting in the abandoned chapel of a nearby monastery. She explained the situation to them, revealing the details of Bardolph's plot and the growing threat of rebellion. She appealed to their sense of loyalty, their love for Thornwick, their desire for a better future for their children. "We cannot stand by and watch as our homes, our families, our lives are threatened by these power-hungry nobles," she said, her voice filled with passion. "We must act. We must fight back. We must protect what is ours." The women, initially hesitant and fearful, were inspired by Juliana's courage and determination. They agree to help her, to use their own networks of contacts, their own unique skills and knowledge, to gather information, to spread the word, to counter the rebellion's propaganda. They formed a secret network, a web of spies and informants, working behind the scenes to undermine Bardolph's efforts, to expose his lies, to rally support for Rhys. They used their positions in the marketplace, in the taverns, in the homes of the nobility, to gather intelligence, to spread rumors, to sow discord among the conspirators. Juliana, leading this unlikely band of rebels, felt a renewed sense of purpose, a surge of energy and determination. She was no longer just a captive, a pawn in the games of men. She was a leader, a warrior, a force to be reckoned with. She knew that she was taking a great risk, that if she were caught, the consequences would be dire. But she was willing to risk everything to protect Rhys, to save Thornwick, to build a better future for her people. She went out, past the walls, and saw the growing danger. Chapter 17. A Knight's Confession. Juliana's clandestine efforts, aided by her network of women, began to bear fruit. They uncovered evidence of Bardolph's plot, including letters, weapons caches, and lists of conspirators. They disrupted his meetings, spread disinformation among his followers, and even managed to turn some of his key allies against him. The rebellion, once a growing threat, began to falter. Bardolph, increasingly frustrated and paranoid, found his plans thwarted at every turn. He suspected treachery, but he couldn't identify the source. He lashed out, ordering his men to crack down on any suspected dissent, arresting and imprisoning anyone who dared to speak out against him. His heavy-handed tactics, however, only served to further alienate the people and strengthen their support for Rhys. The women's network, working tirelessly behind the scenes, spread the word of Bardolph's cruelty and injustice, painting him as a tyrant and Rhys as a just and compassionate ruler. Meanwhile, Rhys, initially unaware of Juliana's activities, began to notice the shift in the mood of the people. He saw the growing support for his rule, the waning enthusiasm for the rebellion, the increasing isolation of Bardolph and his followers. He questioned his advisors, his captains, his spies, trying to understand the source of this change. But no one could give him a satisfactory answer. They all spoke of rumors, of whispers, of a growing sense of hope and unity among the people, but they couldn't pinpoint the cause. One evening, as Rhys was sitting alone in his chambers, lost in thought, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was Juliana, her face pale but resolute, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "Rhys," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." He gestured for her to enter, his heart filled with a sense of foreboding. He knew that something was amiss, that she had something important to tell him. She closed the door behind her and approached him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She took a deep breath and began to speak, revealing everything: her secret network, her clandestine activities, her efforts to undermine Bardolph's rebellion. Rhys listened in silence, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief to anger to admiration. He couldn't believe that she had taken such risks, that she had defied his authority, that she had single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of the rebellion. "You should have told me, Juliana," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and concern. "You could have been killed. Bardolph is a dangerous man." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I had to do something. I couldn't stand by and watch as Thornwick descended into chaos. I had to protect you, to protect our people." He reached out and took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "You are incredible, Juliana," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You are brave, resourceful, and utterly reckless." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that lit up his face. "I should be angry with you," he said, his voice soft. "But I cannot be. I am proud of you. You have saved Thornwick. You have saved me." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, his body pressing against hers. He looked into her eyes, his gaze filled with love and gratitude. "I have been a fool, Juliana," he confessed, his voice husky. "I have been so focused on my own fears, my own doubts, that I have failed to see the strength, the courage, the wisdom that lies within you. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that spoke of his love, his admiration, his utter devotion. "I love you, Juliana," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I love you more than words can say. You are my queen, my partner, my soulmate. I will never doubt you again." Juliana's eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. She had feared his anger, his disapproval, but instead, she had found his love, his acceptance, his complete and unwavering trust. The knight had confessed, and it wasn't of past battles. Chapter 18. The Gathering Storm. With Bardolph's rebellion effectively crushed, and his treachery exposed thanks to Juliana's efforts and Rhys's subsequent public denouncement of the Lord, a fragile peace settled over Thornwick. However, it was a peace born of exhaustion and vigilance, not of genuine resolution. The underlying tensions, the resentments of the old nobility, the lingering scars of war, remained. Rhys, now fully aware of Juliana's capabilities and her unwavering loyalty, began to rely on her more and more. He included her in his council meetings, sought her advice on matters of state, and treated her as his equal, his partner in ruling Thornwick. Juliana, empowered by Rhys's trust and her own growing confidence, blossomed into a true leader. She used her influence to promote reconciliation, to heal the divisions within Thornwick, to build a more just and equitable society. She championed the cause of the common folk, advocating for their rights, improving their living conditions, and ensuring that they had a voice in the governance of Thornwick. But even as they worked together to rebuild and reform Thornwick, a new threat loomed on the horizon. Word reached them of a gathering storm, a coalition of disgruntled lords and ambitious rivals who were uniting against Rhys, seeking to exploit the perceived weakness of his rule and seize control of Thornwick for themselves. This new threat was even more dangerous than Elric's previous assault or Bardolph's internal rebellion. It was a well-organized, well-funded, and well-led coalition, comprised of several powerful lords who had long resented Rhys's rise to power and his progressive policies. Rhys knew that he faced a formidable challenge, a war that would test his strength, his leadership, and his very survival. He began to prepare for the inevitable conflict, strengthening Thornwick's defenses, training his troops, and seeking alliances with neighboring lords who were loyal to him. Juliana, ever at his side, offered her counsel and support, helping him to devise strategies, to manage resources, and to maintain the morale of his people. She also continued to use her network of contacts to gather intelligence, to learn the plans of their enemies, to identify their weaknesses. One evening, as they were studying maps and military reports in Rhys's private chambers, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter. Rhys opened the letter and read it, his face growing pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What is it, Rhys?" Juliana asked, her voice filled with concern. "What has happened?" Rhys handed her the letter, his hand trembling. "It is from Lord Darien," he said, his voice hoarse. "He has betrayed me. He has joined the coalition against me." Lord Darien had been one of Rhys's closest allies, a trusted friend and advisor. His betrayal was a devastating blow, a sign that the tide was turning against Rhys, that his enemies were gaining strength. Juliana read the letter, her heart sinking. Darien's message was blunt and brutal. He accused Rhys of tyranny, of incompetence, of betraying the traditions of Thornwick. He declared his allegiance to the coalition and vowed to fight against Rhys until he was overthrown. "This is a disaster, Rhys," Juliana said, her voice trembling. "Darien's defection will embolden our enemies and weaken our alliances. We must act quickly, decisively." Rhys nodded, his face grim. "I know," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "But what can we do? We are outnumbered, outmatched. Our enemies are gathering. Their forces are growing stronger every day." Juliana looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We will fight, Rhys," she said, her voice firm. "We will not surrender. We will not let them take Thornwick. We will find a way to win, even against overwhelming odds." She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We are not alone, Rhys," she said, her voice soft. "We have each other. We have our loyal followers. We have the people of Thornwick who believe in us, who trust us to protect them." Rhys looked into her eyes, and he saw the strength, the courage, the unwavering love that shone within them. He felt a surge of hope, a renewed sense of determination. "You are right, Juliana," he said, his voice filled with renewed resolve. "We will fight. We will win. We will show them that Thornwick will not be defeated, that our love, our unity, our strength will prevail." The gathering storm was upon them. Chapter 19. Battle for Thornwick. The coalition forces, led by a triumvirate of ambitious lords, marched on Thornwick, their numbers vast, their banners a tapestry of defiance against Rhys's rule. They laid siege to the castle, surrounding it with a sea of soldiers, siege engines, and encampments, determined to starve Rhys and his followers into submission or crush them in a final, decisive assault. Rhys, despite being outnumbered, refused to be intimidated. He rallied his troops, strengthened the castle's defenses, and prepared for a long and bloody siege. He knew that the fate of Thornwick, his own life, and his future with Juliana, hung in the balance. Juliana, ever at his side, played a crucial role in the defense of Thornwick. She organized the women of the castle, assigning them tasks such as tending to the wounded, preparing food, repairing defenses, and even assisting in the manning of the walls. She moved among the defenders, offering encouragement, boosting morale, and reminding them of what they were fighting for: their homes, their families, their freedom. The siege wore on, days turning into weeks, weeks into months. The coalition forces launched repeated assaults against the castle walls, but Rhys's defenders, inspired by his leadership and Juliana's unwavering spirit, repelled them each time, inflicting heavy casualties. Food and supplies began to dwindle, and the defenders grew weary and hungry. But they refused to surrender, their loyalty to Rhys and their determination to protect Thornwick unwavering. Juliana, witnessing the suffering of her people, knew that they could not hold out indefinitely. She urged Rhys to consider a daring plan, a desperate gamble that could either break the siege or lead to their utter destruction. "We must sally forth, Rhys," she said, her voice urgent. "We must attack them, disrupt their lines, break their morale. We cannot simply sit here and wait for them to starve us out." Rhys was hesitant. He knew that a sortie was a risky maneuver, that it could expose his forces to a devastating counterattack. But he also knew that Juliana was right, that they could not afford to remain passive, to wait for their inevitable defeat. He agreed to her plan, and together they devised a strategy. They would launch a surprise attack at dawn, targeting the weakest point in the enemy's lines, aiming to create chaos and confusion, to disrupt their siege engines, and to force them to retreat. The night before the planned sortie, Rhys and Juliana stood together on the ramparts, looking out at the vast encampment of their enemies, the flickering campfires stretching as far as the eye could see. "Are you afraid, Juliana?" Rhys asked, his voice soft. "Yes," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I am more afraid of losing you, of losing Thornwick, of losing everything we have fought for." He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We will face this together, my love," he said, his voice tender. "And we will prevail. I promise you." At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, Rhys led his forces out of the castle gates, charging towards the enemy lines with a ferocity and determination that surprised even themselves. The battle was fierce and bloody. Rhys, at the forefront of the attack, fought like a lion, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his battle cry echoing across the battlefield. Juliana, watching from the castle walls, held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, praying for his safety, for their victory. The surprise attack caught the coalition forces off guard, throwing them into disarray. Rhys's men, outnumbered but not outmatched, fought with a courage and determination that inspired awe and fear in their enemies. The tide of the battle began to turn. The coalition forces, initially confident of victory, found themselves on the defensive, their lines breaking, their morale crumbling. Rhys, seeing the opportunity, pressed the attack, driving his men forward, pushing the enemy back, forcing them to retreat. The battle raged for hours, but in the end, Rhys's forces, against all odds, prevailed. The coalition army was routed, their siege broken, their hopes of conquering Thornwick shattered. It was a bloody victory, with loss on both sides. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The victory at Thornwick was decisive, but it came at a great cost. Many brave men and women had fallen, and the castle itself bore the scars of the long and brutal siege. Rhys, though victorious, was weary and somber, his heart heavy with the loss of life and the knowledge that the peace he had fought so hard to achieve was still fragile. Juliana, too, felt the weight of the victory. She had witnessed firsthand the horrors of war, the suffering of her people, the constant threat to their lives and their future. She knew that the battle for Thornwick was over, but the struggle for peace and stability was far from finished. In the aftermath of the battle, Rhys set about rebuilding Thornwick, repairing the damaged fortifications, tending to the wounded, and burying the dead. He also had to deal with the captured enemy lords, deciding their fate and ensuring that they would never again pose a threat to his rule. Juliana, as always, was at his side, offering her counsel, her support, and her unwavering love. She helped him to make difficult decisions, to balance justice with mercy, to find a way to heal the wounds of war and unite his people. One of the most pressing issues was the fate of the captured lords. Some of his advisors urged him to execute them, to make an example of them and deter any future rebellions. Others argued for leniency, suggesting that imprisonment or exile would be sufficient punishment. Rhys, torn between his desire for justice and his longing for peace, turned to Juliana for guidance. "What should I do, Juliana?" he asked, his voice filled with anguish. "How can I ensure the safety of Thornwick without resorting to further bloodshed?" Juliana looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion and wisdom. "You must show them mercy, Rhys," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you must also show them strength. You must demonstrate that you are a just and compassionate ruler, but also one who will not tolerate treachery or rebellion." She suggested a compromise. The lords who had actively participated in the siege, who had led the coalition forces against Rhys, would be stripped of their titles and lands and banished from Thornwick forever. Those who had merely joined the coalition out of fear or coercion would be given a chance to redeem themselves, to swear fealty to Rhys and prove their loyalty through service. Rhys, impressed by Juliana's wisdom and compassion, agreed to her plan. He summoned the captured lords before him and announced his decision. Some were defiant, cursing him and vowing revenge. Others were relieved, grateful for his mercy, and willing to pledge their loyalty. The reckoning was swift and decisive. The rebellious lords were stripped of their power and banished, their lands and titles distributed among Rhys's loyal followers. Those who had chosen to redeem themselves were given positions of responsibility, tasked with helping to rebuild Thornwick and restore peace and prosperity to the land. With the external threat neutralized and the internal divisions healed, at least for the moment, Rhys and Juliana finally had a chance to focus on their own future. They had been through so much together, faced so many challenges, overcome so many obstacles. Their love had been tested by fire, and it had emerged stronger, deeper, more resilient. One evening, as they were standing together on the ramparts, looking out at the peaceful landscape, Rhys turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with love and adoration. "Juliana," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "you have been my strength, my inspiration, my guiding light. You have saved Thornwick. You have saved me. I cannot imagine my life without you." He knelt before her, taking her hand in his. "Will you do me the honor," he asked, his voice trembling, "of becoming my wife, my queen, the ruler of Thornwick by my side?" Juliana's eyes filled with tears of joy. She had longed to hear those words, to finally be able to share her life with the man she loved, the man who had captured her heart and her soul. "Yes, Rhys," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife, your queen, your partner, for all time." He rose and embraced her, his arms holding her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their shared destiny. The reckoning was done. Love and duty at last aligned. Epilogue. The wedding of Rhys and Juliana was a grand affair, celebrated throughout Thornwick with feasting, dancing, and joyous revelry. The people, relieved to be free from the threat of war and grateful for the just and compassionate rule of their lord and lady, rejoiced in the union of their beloved rulers. Rhys and Juliana, radiant with happiness, exchanged vows in the castle chapel, their love for each other shining brightly in their eyes. They were no longer captor and captive, but equals, partners, soulmates, bound together by a love that had been forged in the crucible of conflict and adversity. In the years that followed, Rhys and Juliana ruled Thornwick wisely and well. They brought peace and prosperity to the land, fostering trade, encouraging agriculture, and promoting justice and equality for all. They rebuilt the castle, strengthened its defenses, and transformed it into a center of learning and culture. Juliana, using her knowledge of herbal remedies and healing, established a hospital and a school for midwives, ensuring that the people of Thornwick had access to quality healthcare. She also championed the cause of education, establishing schools and libraries and encouraging the arts and sciences. Rhys, guided by Juliana's wisdom and compassion, proved to be a just and merciful ruler. He listened to the concerns of his people, addressed their grievances, and ensured that all were treated fairly under the law. He fostered a sense of unity and loyalty among his subjects, creating a strong and stable realm that was respected and admired throughout the land. They were blessed with children, strong sons and beautiful daughters, who inherited their parents' courage, intelligence, and compassion. The lineage of Thornwick was secured, its future bright and promising. Rhys and Juliana, though they faced challenges and difficulties along the way, never wavered in their love for each other or their commitment to their people. They ruled together, side by side, their love a beacon of hope and inspiration for all who knew them. As the years passed, and their hair turned silver and their steps slowed, their love only deepened. They had lived a full and meaningful life, a life of adventure, of challenge, of triumph, and of enduring love. One peaceful evening, as they sat together by the fire in their private chambers, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with contentment, they looked back on their lives, on the journey they had taken together, from the dark days of captivity and conflict to the bright dawn of peace and prosperity. "We have been blessed, my love," Rhys said, his voice soft and filled with gratitude. "We have found love, happiness, and purpose. We have built a life together, a legacy that will endure for generations to come." Juliana smiled, her eyes shining with love. "Yes, my Rhys," she said, her voice gentle. "We have been truly blessed. And I am grateful for every moment, for every challenge, for every joy we have shared." They leaned into each other, their love a warm and comforting presence in the twilight of their years. They had faced the storms of life together, and they had emerged victorious, their love stronger, their bond unbreakable. Their story, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the enduring human spirit, would be told and retold for generations to come, a legend whispered in the halls of Thornwick and beyond. The ending was, in truth, a glorious beginning.